Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Darcy Norman. Darcy is the Director of Performance Science at Kitman Labs, also a performance coach for the US Men's National Team and performance consultant as well. So I'm sure many people know of you, Darcy, and the work that you've done. But looking through on your website today, the clubs you've been involved with, like there's a long list there and a long list of illustrious clubs as well. So, but first of all, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate you having me on.
No, not at all. We've got some exciting stuff I want to jump into in a little bit, but just to start with, in case anyone's been living in a cave, they don't know anything about yourself. Do you want to just take us through a little bit of your background in terms of who you've been involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally from little town, Grand Prairie, Alberta, Canada. Grew up, I played a bunch of sports in high school, like most guys, probably most people, and then got into competitive alpine ski racing and ended up competing in college down in the US. And then that's where I did my schooling. So I got my undergrad at Washington State University in kinesiology, athletic training, and biology. And then ended up a few years later after graduating, going back to PT school and became a physio at the University of Washington. And then had a private practice for a little bit, then joined what was formerly Athletes Performance, now Exos, in the US back in, 2003, before performance training was an industry. And then through that network, that kind of opened my eyes to a lot of opportunity. You know, we were kind of mountain folks, want to get back to the mountains, and ended up moving to Lake Tahoe, California. And then I still kind of consulted with Exos, but took a role with Team High Road Cycling. It was T-Mobile, then became High Road after all the drug scandals. And then, so that was a very interesting time, 5 years with them. And then had the opportunity, got into football. My first gig with the professional football, European football, or soccer as we call it, club was Bayern Munich in 2008 as a fitness rehab coach. So I was with them 2008 through 10, 3 different coaches in that time period. And then had the opportunity, went back to the States, had the opportunity to join the German national team and doing stuff with Adidas on some consulting things. So I was with them through the 2014 World Cup, then had the opportunity to move to Rome and take on director of performance for AS Roma. So the first team through the club, down into the academy. And then, we decided to come back. Kids were getting older, need to get them through high school and off to college. And so we came back to the States and had the opportunity to start up with US Men's National Team in 2019. Previous to that was with Kitman, joined Kitman Labs at that point. That was September of 18. And here we are today.
And we've just been talking about some of the exciting stuff that's going on at Kitman as well. So I don't know if you want to touch on any of that now as well.
Yeah, I mean, lots going on, involved with a bunch of different teams, groups, organizations across the globe, just a bunch of phenomenal practitioners trying to move the needle forward and, trying to do something that probably hasn't been done in sport and giving practitioners, practical tools through electronic medical recording, athlete management systeming, be able to do real-time analysis and analytics within the platform. So a bunch of really good stuff coming down the line. Starting to work with the National Football League as League EMR and just acquired Presagia Sport, which is a kind of an EMR based company here in the US. And so, starting to work with a bunch of Power 5 and NCAA schools here in the US. So lots of good, exciting stuff and things going on. So really enjoying it.
Brilliant. Well, I wanted to ask just to start with, just to get your perspective and start a bit broad, your perspective on strength conditioning in football. So from being involved at a number of different clubs, but looking at it as an overall, like in terms of S&C in general, in terms of preparation, physical preparation for players, how would you rate the level that we're at and the sort of culture of S&C in football?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've come a long way since I worked in football, from 2008. It's definitely gotten a lot better. But I still think we have a long way to go to continue to get it better. I think, just when you look at other sports and the demands of those sports and how they've integrated strength and conditioning, like Australian rules football, AFL, the guys are running the same volume, if not like actually more volume than what a footballer would do. And they're, strong, big guys. And not that, footballers need to be big by any means. And I don't, I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes is they parallel strength with size. And that's certainly not the case. But I think we can do a lot more, and the mentality is certainly changing, and you're seeing, more physical, stronger guys out there. And I think, at the end of the day, you can get more fit by being stronger pound for pound, because your energy per step to cover that distance is going to be less, relatively speaking, if your max strength is bigger. And then, obviously with the metabolic capabilities. So, I think in theory, you can become more fit just by being stronger.
And with the clubs that you've been involved with, in terms of culture and I suppose buy-in from players in terms of that developing max strength, what's the sort of reaction been like for players? Has it always been that players have sort of got on with it, or have you fought some battles along the way to get your views and your philosophies across?
Yeah, I mean, your belief system is like your religion, right? And if I start changing your religion or ask you to change your religion, you're going to be a little reluctant because that's your belief system that's gotten you to where you're at today. And so it was definitely an eye-opener when I first started in football. Because it's a very heavy technical based sport. And so you don't, a lot of the time is on that rather than in the weight room, compared to an American football kind of scenario where you need that size and volume. And so it made me rethink my approach, hands down, because, my first job with Bayern, I've told this story a few times, had a player. And he's like, Darcy, I'm the best player at my position in the world, and I've never lifted a weight. So why should I start now? I was like, it's a good point. I need to take that in and think about it and reapproach how I'm gonna, get people to buy in. So kind of thinking about it and regrouping, I thought about, if the ultimate goal is to improve power and power output and power repeatability or power endurance, then, if you scientifically look at it, where power is work divided by time, right? And so we think, we always think we got to improve or do more of the work part to improve the power part. But if we look at the time piece, that is based on efficiency. So if I can do something in less time, I become more powerful. So then I started thinking about it, and, just if we can improve people's movement efficiencies without necessarily moving the work part, then we're making them more powerful and they can do more with less. And so that's really, depending on the spectrum and of where they're at, that's kind of the approach. So it's because everybody wants to move better. Everybody wants to feel better while they're moving. And so, that's where we started. And then once they got proficient at all those pieces and were really good at everything, then it's like, okay, the only option here is to add resistance.
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of how it got started. And then, they were kind of bought into the program. And you got to meet people for where they're at, and have those conversations, build that trust and move them along.
I suppose using that language though, becomes a lot more relatable to a player, doesn't it? Where you're talking suddenly, you're not talking about strength so much anymore, where they might think muscle. You're talking about moving better. You're talking about staying injury free, and then you've got that buy-in, haven't you? And you can add the resistance at that later time.
Yeah, and I mean the technology now between like velocity-based training, what you're able to do with force profiling, and like a product like the 1080 Sprint, is
Yeah.
it starts really taking the ability to where they see that this work in the gym and the strength turns into watts. Watts is power, and power is speed and acceleration. And so, and they can have these measurable values to see that the buy-in becomes a lot greater. So the technology has certainly helped, kind of bridge that gap between the weight room and the field.
And with on that as well, like the other thing I was going to ask is how we need to improve, or how a program should maybe be progressed, keeping in mind the way the game is going. Like, we're getting more powerful, the game's getting quicker. You've seen teams now, the presses and the game. I'm putting a timestamp on this episode, but the game at the weekend in the Premier League with Liverpool against City, there was times in that game when the intensity was crazy. So you're looking at games like that, like the game is evolving all the time, isn't it? So as practitioners, when we're physically preparing players, where do you see, and I know it's a bit of a question that we don't know what's going to be in the future, but where do you see as maybe some potential areas that we need to work on and improve?
Yeah, I think it is exactly what you said. Like the trend is in power repeatability and training intensively. So and really intensive amounts, and then obviously progressing that in a smart way, where it becomes sustainable and the ability for the players. And it's interesting now currently, at least in the national or the international, like FIFA, with our qualifiers, we get 5 subs. So that changes almost the dynamic of the game, because we're going to use and we call them solutions. We're going to use all our 5 solutions pretty much all the time, because the way we play, the way we want to play, is we need to have that high pressing intensive way of playing. And so you got to have your training like that. You got to physically have the ability, because again, even from a recovery standpoint, if I'm stronger pound for pound, if that work, the energy is relatively less because I'm stronger. Now I've done less work relative to if I wasn't as strong. So now if I've done less work, that helps me recover quicker, because of that whole, how that is all set up. And so if these guys are stronger, and this was some interesting things at Rome, like, we would have some guys that were really bought into the program, at games, they would just be making runs for the sake of making runs, because they just weren't tired from the game, because the pace of the game wasn't hard, and they could recover really quick because they were, so physically strong that they were able to endure that intensity game in, game out.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about managing the individual as well. And I was going to bring up a specific case study, and I'm glad he had an absolute brilliant game at the weekend as well, because it ties in quite nicely. And I'm going to talk about. But when you search for your name, which I was doing the last few days, looking for topics to talk about on the podcast, Mo Salah is someone that spoke about the work you did with him. And obviously, he's in top form at the moment, and you saw it at the weekend. You touched on strength before, and there was some points in that game where you could argue, like, if you're looking at a player's physical strength, then he portrays it, doesn't he? Like, there's times where he's holding 3-4 players off at one time. But in terms of managing the individual, I just wanted to touch on that. So when you've got a squad of players, you're obviously working on everything that we spoke about so far, but then you get an individual like a Mo Salah or whoever it's going to be. What's your sort of focus, and what's your processing going through, making sure that each individual is managed?
Yeah, I think, first you got to prioritize. They're there to play football. They're there, it takes a team to win. So obviously the pitch-based stuff is the priority, and what the coach needs to get done and have done is priority. And then it's really around having flexible systems. And so, that was probably one of the biggest things I learned in my time at Exos, was just how do you kind of compartmentalize all these pieces where they're almost like recipe or ingredients. And then, depending on what you want to cook up for that person, you can use the various ingredients in the right amounts to get what you're trying to get out of them from a stimulus perspective. And so, it's just really having flexibility. So I kind of, my nomenclature, how I systematize stuff is really from my time at Athletes Performance or Exos. And so, what can we do from a movement skill perspective? What can we do from a mobility stability perspective? What can we do from a multi-directional perspective? And then, from a weight perspective, lower body pushes, pulls, upper body push, pull, vertical, horizontal. So all, kind of the traditional categories, the plyometric ability of the athlete, or the elasticity piece. And then it's just microdosing it in various pieces. So I always say it's like brushing your teeth. If you, brush and floss every day, the dentist visit is really easy, super simple. But if you only do it once a year, it's going to take a lot. They got to hack on you for a while. Your gums are bleeding and it's not pretty, right? And so it's really just finding out what they're able to tolerate, and then, peppering it in little doses. So, for a guy like Momo, his success is all him, 100%. He was really motivated, as I'm sure he still is today, to be the best. And so he's like, hey, I need to get stronger. I want to get stronger. And so we worked on it, and each day he came in, and depending on how things were going from a week perspective, how much he was playing, then we would prioritize his programming, and he executed, and it definitely showed from his time in Rome, and the World Cup he had after that, and same with the time in Liverpool. So and you see, there is case studies around football where you see guys, before, when they were younger and they got into it, and you see the kind of the body transformations. And obviously also Ronaldo, for the age that he's at, and what he's still able to do is credit to him, and just sticking with it. And none of these guys also, when we talk about strength being equal to size or not equal to size, it's not like these guys are huge dudes, right? But they from a bodybuilding or American football perspective, but they're, you see them with their shirts off, they're put together, and they're strong in the weight room, and they can move weight relative to their body weight. And and they just got to work at it. And it is also a mental attitude, because if, guys like, it's going to make me too tired. And, if you've already succumbed to that before you even kind of stepped into the weight room, that's exactly what's going to happen. So you kind of, Momo's a guy who's extremely positive, and, he kind of manifests what he wants to happen, and that's what happens. And I think that's, when you work with these players that have that kind of attitude, really the sky's the limit.
Yeah, 100%. And how do you ensure then, or do you incorporate into the program that transfer? Because developing strength power in the gym has to have a crossover onto the pitch, doesn't it? And we probably all can think of, I'm sure the listeners can think of certain players where they'll dominate in the gym, they'll do well in the gym, but it might not cross over as well to the pitch. Whereas when we're talking about someone like a Ronaldo, someone like a Salah, it obviously does. And again, I referenced the game at the weekend, go back and watch it. There's certain times in the game where he shows that strength. So what's your sort of approach for that, making sure that we get that transfer onto the pitch?
Yeah, I mean, I think first it's being clear that you have to technically have the abilities, right? Like, so it's not like these guys, Momo and Ronaldo, are not practicing their football. And so that's certainly a priority. And then, the gym stuff comes after the fact. But I mean, how I see it is we practice movement skills, right? So everything that we do in the gym is very much related to what they're going to produce out on the pitch. And so it's not like we get into these kind of circus exercises, to try and replicate exactly what's happening on the pitch with a ball, but like anything related to linear acceleration, change of direction, multi-directional change of direction, or pushing, lower body strength, different positions, with their upper body. I think one area that I call it stability limiting strength. And so, like a single leg squat is a great example. Is you're only gonna be able to squat as much as you can stabilize. And same thing, if I'm doing a, kind of a side plank row, I'm only going to be able to pull what my trunk is going to be able to stabilize. And so I think when we look at programming for footballers or soccer players, a lot of that stability limiting lifting, it reduces the overall weight load, which reduces any kind of muscle soreness, but yet they still get that neurologic buy-in from their body having to self-organize to figure out what they need to do to stabilize, but yet still pull a weight. Because, I always find it really interesting where if you lock somebody in a machine, you might have two guys that can pull the same amount of weight. But now you put them on one leg and one guy can pull that same weight and the other guy can pull a fraction of that weight.
Yeah.
So it's not like one guy got weaker. It's just one guy can put it into practice and their brains can self-organize themselves to figure out what they need to tighten and use to be able to stabilize to pull that weight. And so that's probably a big part of how we do things is finding those stability limiting pieces, because when you get out on the pitch, you're never in this nice, kind of machine-based structure to do your activity. You're, rotating on one leg and moving here and going there and doing all those things. And so, maybe that's where the transfer comes, is I think part of it. And then, it's their ability also to extrapolate those pieces and move it over as well.
Because that's sport specific, if we're going to put it in air quotes, like that sport specific training can be done very well, can't it? But also you see some horror shows where people are trying to replicate things too much. Well, I suppose what's your views on the difference? Like, why do people go? Why is it done well and why is it done not so well?
Yeah, I think you still have to pay attention to movement quality. And, I think when we come back to that power equals work divided by time, and time being efficiency. And so if you can get the body moving, like I am always going to direct somebody to move in the most efficient way possible. And now they might not be able to due to, length tension relationships, tightnesses, hip, like joint issues, whatever the case may be. And so we'll work to try and solve that to give them the best opportunity so they're not robbing Peter to pay Paul to get through emotion. And I think, a lot of people, or from what I see, they don't necessarily pay attention to the movement quality piece of it. So if you're doing a single leg balance with an upper body row into kind of a running position, I want to make sure that you're sitting back in your hips, you're getting deep in your hips, you're not over rotated or rotated in any way. And we're going to start on a point where you can do it well first, with good stability, with good quality, and then we're going to make that the path of least resistance, rather than just a motion that looks like it without the quality piece put in. And there is some folks that would argue like, oh, it's a chaotic sport, you need to do different angles and different things, and totally agree with that. But if we're starting out, I want to control the quality first, get really good at something, then we can add all the craziness and chaos around it. But if we start with the craziness and chaos, then it's hard for them to they don't have the experience to self-organize of this is my stable base. This is what I need to go back to. And we need to teach that first before we can kind of add in all the craziness around it.
I think that's a great point, because it's basically, if we're going straight into the chaotic environment, that's essentially the game, isn't it? We're getting too specific too soon in a way.
And I've seen, professional European level footballers that are probably some of the worst athletes I've ever worked with from just a pure athletic standpoint, where I'm like, gosh, how do you even run? Because they're so uncoordinated, but they're phenomenal soccer players or football players. But from an athletic standpoint, they lack a lot of pieces. And so from that efficiency side, it just wears on them, and they tend to be the guys that get injured more, and they tend to be the guys that, just have more kind of issues.
And I love a seamless link, because we've gone straight into, I wanted to talk again about the relationship between physical development, but also technical development. I'm just with that as well, because you touched on it before about players that might turn around and say they're one of the best in the world. Why do we need to develop physically? I'm performing. But at the same time, I know you've had players that have been towards the back end of the career, older players that obviously technically great, maybe physically have been great in the past, and some speed maybe has dropped, or they might have even just relied more on the technical ability. But the sort of relationship between the physical development and technical development, how that maybe determines your approach with the players.
Yeah, I mean, the physical development, is going to, as you said, as they age, it's going to just naturally drop. And then, as that drops, the technical ability hopefully over time gets better, so they can read the game better, they can be more efficient. But when you're getting at that elite level, like it is, we're talking percentages. If you can improve a 1 or 2%, that could be a significant piece between, like, just take a joint grinding on each other, right? Like, you have something pounding and hitting each other, and the difference between it pounding and hitting each other or not is like millimeters, right? So if I can make a millimeter of difference in your soft tissue, in joint compression, in the coordination of how the instantaneous center of rotation of how a joint works, that's the difference between a joint getting worn out or a joint operating normally. And so it really comes down to, what's the motivation of the player? Are they willing to put in the work? And the education piece, the why are we doing it, and how's that, does the why of why we're doing it connect to their why of why they should do it and why they're motivated to do it? And then it's usually not a problem. And there's numerous cases, again, in my time at Exos, where we would get players on the twilight end of their career, and they wanted one more contract, and they would come in and put in the work, and they were like, gosh, I wish I would have known this 10 years ago. My career would have been even longer. And so it's like those things, as you get older, you get wiser, and then you wish you would have done something. And so now you're like, telling your kids, like, God, if I was your age, I would have done this. We would have totally different, had way more success. So it's part of life, living and learning and communicating, building trust between the practitioner and the athlete, and kind of meeting where they're at and moving it forward.
Yeah, I've spoken to quite a few people about working with experienced players, because we've spoke a lot about learning from players, because they've had obviously a lot of experience working with different coaches and different ways of working. Well, then I suppose there's two ways of looking at it, isn't there? They're either sort of setting the routine of, this is how I've always done it, or like you've just said, they're trying to get and buy those few extra seasons or months, whatever it is. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? But I thought I'd ask, because I know you've had some incredible, talented players right at the top of the game, but also at the back end of their careers. I'm thinking of people like Francesco Totti, people like that. So it's just interesting to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is always just trust with the people. Like, for everything that we're doing, it's in the we're at a player first or player centric approach. So whatever I can do to help that person get better is what I'm going to do. And, within legal and my personal values. And it's not about me, right? Like, it's about them. They're the athlete trying to get from A to B. And without them, I wouldn't have a role in, them trying to go anywhere. And so it's about them and helping them. And so trying to figure out first where they're at, what they're trying to accomplish, why it's important to them, what's important to them, and then, kind of building on that relationship and trust to move them forward. And, there's a lot, like, I think also have to have an open mind. We're constantly learning. Where just because it was published in a research article doesn't mean it's necessarily true, right? Like, it might have been true for that research article and that little cohort, but when you broaden it to a bigger scope, it might not be as applicable. Like the Franco Impizzelli, the work he's done, around not debunking acute chronic, but just bringing out the realities so we know it for what it really is. And then same thing, he's just published some work on the same thing around Nordic hamstrings. And people were kind of treating it like it was the holy grail. If I do these, I'm going to be hamstring bomb proof. I'm never going to have a hamstring problem. And we know that's absolutely not possible, right? Like, people still have hamstring problems. And so there's other things that we need to consider and look at. So we always assume we're right. But I think one of the things, just for that confirmation bias is in decision-making is, you should be looking at why, what are all the things that could prove you wrong? Because we'll go find the information to fulfill why we think we're right, but it's all the other information that says you're wrong that you should be looking at to make sure you're kind of considering all pieces.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a great point. We talk about having networks of coaches that you can reach out to, but also we've spoken about in the last few podcasts, having sort of mentors or a circle of coaches that will question you as well. Not in a way of just being an idiot, but actually trying to get you to think about what you're saying. And if it is something where you're falling into the trap of only Nordics, actually getting someone to question that and giving you rationale. And that makes you better, doesn't it? That improves you as a coach.
Yeah, totally. I think it's like anything. The more you learn just by walking in a room, right, and seeing different things, to be like, oh, that's interesting. How did they come up with that? And taking the time to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So you can, understand those little nuances, because if you just walk in and see somebody doing something, it's easy through your vision to assume why they're doing it. Right. So taking the time to be like, hey, Ben, why are you doing that exercise? What's, what about it? Is it why you're fitting it in here and here? Because there might be other reasons that I'm not even aware of. And so, just taking that time to understand all the moving pieces, so you have a much better picture of, why folks are doing what they're doing. So I think it's critical. And, that was also probably the interesting thing of working in different countries, different cultures. Germany's successful, Italy's successful, America's successful, all in their own ways. So what is it about it that makes it successful or not successful? And in trying to take little bits from all these different pieces, to move it along. And because you realize there's a lot of ways to go about things, and you just got to kind of have your why well organized and then get after it.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to just touch on as well your experiences of tactical periodization, which is something we spoke about on the podcast quite a bit, but where S&C fits into that model, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around sort of strength conditioning, tactical periodization. So your experiences on where it sort of fit in.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the themes, right? Like if you do smaller sided games, I tend to pair the weightlifting like more lower body stuff with smaller sided games, and then, kind of more speed stuff with more open field based stuff. And then two, like, you also have to realize the human body is going to adapt to anything, right? So some people like lifting before, some people like lifting after. And so you, again, kind of back to the flexible systems, how do you get it in? My feeling is, if we're going to work on a strength quality, I want to prioritize that, where when we go out onto the field, your limiting factor is going to be your metabolic abilities, right? Like, you're going to have muscular fatigue with metabolic scenarios. So I don't really feel like, if I'm doing a bunch of on pitch training, and if I'm truly working on strength and power, doing it after the fact isn't going to have as much benefit than is if I was to do it beforehand. And so then it becomes a dosage and a volume, so that the player doesn't feel like I've taken all the gas out of their legs, to then go train.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's just complementing it, understanding the player, what they like, what they're used to, dosing it appropriately. So if they are not used to it, that you're moving them in and being able to compensate for it, where, they feel like it's not hindering their ability to work on the pitch. And so, yeah, I think it is great. The more we can be efficient with what we're doing, the better. And so, sometimes you got to separate it, because one issue with the tactical periodization is you're going to be limited by the demand of the game. And if the game isn't going hard enough and you need to go hard, then you're going to have to either change your drills or change what you're trying to do to get those certain qualities. And that's where planning and being really organized and in line with the coaching staff and the performance staff have to have that tight bond. Then you can get really creative and do some cool stuff. And so, and then same thing on the speed side, is you can use all your speed and plyometric and prep stuff as a precursor or warm up, in the air quotes, right? Call it what you want, but then that floats into more acceleration based drills or whatever the case you're trying to do. So it's like any complex system, you need to have great communication amongst all the people that are involved in driving it. And if you do, you can accomplish some fantastic things. If not, then, you end up in these kind of siloed work buckets and just trying to get it in when you can.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I love that sort of flexible approach is so important, isn't it? It's something that, again, loads of people have brought up on the podcast, that ability to adapt and be flexible is key, isn't it? To get your message across and fit in with what everyone else is going to be doing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, if you just look at acceleration, like, how much of the sport is acceleration? And if we're working on these acceleration mechanics, doing some acceleration drills, like doing some build-up acceleration drills before we get into some drills that require that kind of piece, then, kind of to your point earlier about how do you apply or how does the transfer work? That's how it works, is you build it into where here's a learning piece, no different than in soccer or football itself. If you're doing football tricks, you got to start at one place, then you move to the next and move to the next, and you bring them along, right? Or you work on, hey, here's our tactical scenario. Now we're going to put it into a smaller game with no defense. And now we're going to put it, where you have opposition, so that, it builds in a teachable way that people can absorb it and apply it and put it to work. And it's no different from learning football as it is from taking performance-based training and putting it into a football-based model. It's just one more method to integrate into the system.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I want to be respectful of your time, Darcy, because I know you got plenty of stuff going on. So I just wanted to move on to some of the quick fire questions that we do at the end of the podcast. So the first one, it might be hard to narrow down, but some of your biggest influences, or the biggest influences on your career so far.
Oh, wow. I mean, anybody
standout names.
Yeah. Mark Verstegen, Steve Taschen, Greg Berhalter, Louis van Gaal, Jurgen Klinsmann. Like, anybody that's challenged my abilities, and kind of learning along the way. There's a lot of folks, I wouldn't be able to name them all. Yeah, it's just trying to stay open to learning and picking up what you can along the way. But yeah, definitely a lot of great practitioners for sure.
Some pretty good names in there, I've got to say. And Steve gets a mention, so that's good.
Yeah, Steve. I mean, dude, Steve's a top operator, very in tune guy, and that was one of the big pieces of joining the men's national team is with Greg, who I know is a phenomenal coach, and Steve. And I've had a lot of coaches over a period of time. So up until that point, I think it was 10 or 11 coaches in the 10 years in football. So could never really get into a rhythm because we'd have a coaching change. And so, to kind of hop in with Greg and Steve, to really, be with people that are open-minded, to learn and get better. It really proves what you can do from a just group perspective, and paying attention to detail and the collaboration and execution. So really looking forward to the journey we're on. Loving it so far. So it's been great.
Brilliant. And then next one, I always ask, what do you think your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
I would have to go with Range, the book Range. So broad spectrum competency. So I've worked as a fitness coach. I've worked, solely as a physio, as a fitness coach, and everything sports scientist and everything in between. And so, I may not be like super niche-y in any one thing, but I think from a, injury prevention, rehab, performance, kind of can, span the gamut. And so I would have to say that might be my superpower.
Brilliant. And then just finally, I always ask about continual professional development. So not necessarily in terms of courses and things like that, but basically, where do you do your learning now?
Yeah, it's with people smarter than me. So with guys like Steve and Greg and Jordan Webb, and a lot of business books. I find that there's a ton of things we can learn as performance folks in the business world. Like I just finished one book called Customer Success, and phenomenal book. And there's 10 rules to customer success, because essentially anybody you come into contact with is your customer. So your athlete's your customer, the coach you work with is your customer, the club you work for is your customer. And, the number one rule for customer success is make sure you sell to the right client. And so, I think really making sure that your values are aligned with the values of the people that you want to work with. And so, there's a ton of great stuff through the business side of it. And then, it's hard to keep up with all the great stuff that's happening out there, with Martin Buchheit and what he's doing, Les Spellman, and I'm blanking on the fella's first name. Dudu is his last name, an English fella. Yeah.
Jonas,
Jordan, on all the, the rehab stuff. So there's just tons of great information. Like I'm really into the force profiling at the moment, and doing that stuff. So yeah, there's no shortage. If anything, no time to learn it all.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. This has been super, Darcy. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you giving up your time when I know things are so busy. Just finally, if people want to follow what you're up to, where would you direct them?
I'm not, don't seem to have a lot of time for social media besides like probably stalking other people. So Darcy Norman on Twitter, LinkedIn, and then, my email with the national team is dnorman@ussoccer.org, and Kitman Darcy @kitmanlabs.com. Always happy to chat and answer questions, or, talk about new things. And so, yeah, those are probably the bigger ones. Unfortunately, I busy with a lot of stuff, so don't get out on social media too much.
Well, it's all crashed tonight anyway, so it's pointless.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't have to depend on it too much. It's a breath of fresh air for me. I don't feel the pressure.
Exactly. No, but Darcy, thank you very much, mate. Really appreciate it, and best of luck with the rest of the camp that you're on at the moment as well.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to catch up. Don't be a stranger, and appreciate all the work you're doing for the industry and getting all the fine folks that you do have on your podcast. It's been great to listen to.
Thank you, mate.
All right, all the best.